Hey everybody, Zak Wolf, am doing this vlog to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the release of Apple's Final Cut Pro 10 video editing software. This is the release that had a completely new and rewritten version of Apple's beloved Final Cut Pro video editing application that had been available since 1999. And when this rewritten and redesigned Final Cut Pro came out on this date 10 years ago, there was a lot of controversy from editors. It abandoned the classic timeline interface all past versions up to Final Cut Pro 7 had, in favor of what they called a new magnetic timeline, and library bins and stuff like that. When it first came out, people said it was basically iMovie Pro, and I will agree that with the older versions it did seem to have a strong influence from the then current version of iMovie, itself having gone through a similar redesign controversy 4 years before, in 2007. But I will admit, aside from iMovie, it did look more like a typical consumer video editing application at the time. Like the good ones made for Windows 10, like Cyberlink Power Director, or Avid Pinnacle Studio Ultimate, many of which are far more full-featured than the old iMovie and the future ones. But not as much as Final Cut Pro 10 was. You just had to dig a little deeper into Final Cut to find more of the professional features. And there's a good reason why they rewrote and redesigned Final Cut Pro. The beloved prior version was based on pre-Mac OS X coding, as the software was originally designed for the classic Mac OS, specifically Mac OS 8.5 and later. And it was still a 32-bit only application, so it could only work with up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. And by this point, most computers, especially the Macs, were 64-bit systems that could support more than 4 gigabytes of memory. Macs back then would usually have the RAM upgraded in an easy fashion, like with many Windows PCs, and usually it'd be best to have 8 or even 16 gigabytes of RAM for video editing, especially if working for high-definition footage. The new Final Cut Pro 10 was 64-bit, of course, and could work with a lot more memory as a result, utilize all the CPU cores, and have OpenCL support to make the most out of the graphics card. Plus, people complained that it was missing a bunch of useful features that Final Cut Pro 7 had, such as XML import and export, multicam editing, chapter markers for burning disks, server and broadcast monitor support, and OMF and Red RAW support. Fortunately, subsequent updates and releases of the new Final Cut Pro over the years put most of those features back in many cases being able to do them better than Final Cut 7 could, along with more neat new features, and it got more and more pro-oriented with each release. I mean, compare the old version, as you saw, with the latest versions, how it's looked since version 10.3. Looks a lot more professional now, doesn't it? It even has color correction wheels. Now, I will admit, prior to 10's release, I never used the old Final Cut Pro versions that much, outside of my college's TV studio. And I also did not get an Intel processor in Mac until a month after Final Cut Pro 10 had been released. But I did use Final Cut Express on my old G4 Macs. And while it was pretty feature-packed, apparently retaining 3/4 of the power and capabilities of the old Final Cut Pro, the graphic user interface is not as pleasing or easy to follow as Adobe Premiere. It could be so daunting to people new to the program that Final Cut Pro would ship with 4 user manual volumes, and that's not including this Getting Started book. And the worst part was that darn render thing. You apply even a slight color correction filter to your video footage, you can't even play it back unless you render it, at least under the default settings. Though at least in Adobe Premiere, both Elements and Pro, you could still play back your edited footage before rendering it, even if it would be a little choppy at first. But I'd usually save all the rendering in that program until I'm done, or maybe even halfway through a project. That way the final export will go a lot more smoothly. One thing I do like about the new Final Cut Pro then was how it renders in the background. This is a feature I've always found handy, like in the pre-2007 versions of iMovie or in some of the Windows video editing programs I used in my pre-Mac days, like Pinnacle Studio, which I used to make many of my early YouTube poops on way back when. In fact, regarding the iMovie connection there, Final Cut Pro 10 does seem to have brought back several of the features from the old iMovie prior to 2007, including many of the same video effects, featuring third-party plugins support. Another thing I also like carrying over from the post-2007 versions of iMovie was the skimming feature in a library, allowing you to select only part of a clip you want to put in the timeline with greatest of ease. A few other professional video editing programs for Windows have also adopted that method, like Magix Vegas Pro. But this brings up another flaw many people found with the design of Final Cut Pro 10. Instead of the classic project window, where you could import your files to use in the timeline, it had libraries and events akin to iMovie since 2007. Any footage you import for use in a project stays in the library. And as if that weren't enough, unlike in iMovie where only video files are in the library, Final Cut Pro's library would also hold all the images and audio files you import. That could really clutter things up. But in a way, I do find that a bit convenient. Like if I'm working on a YouTube poop and I want to reuse a certain audio file or something, I'd often locate in a handy search dialog above the library window. And I'd also make events for certain video types. I have an event for typical YouTube poop clips, an event for storing footage from Arthur, Caillou and the Busy World of Richard Scarry, an event for footage from the Berenstain Bears, an event for Looney Tunes related stuff, an event for footage of me. You get the idea. Also by default, it had slightly less export options, and that can frustrate pro users, as then they have to send it to the compressor software and render the project in a specific format. But generally the default export options are fine for me. I remember how this new Final Cut Pro used to be one of the few professional video editing applications that had a direct YouTube uploader built in, which I found very handy when making YouTube poops. The only professional Windows video editor I know that has a direct YouTube uploader is Magix Vegas Pro, but recent versions of Final Cut do not have a direct uploader, perhaps due to YouTube changing their uploader system, especially the whole COPPA stuff. But you can export it into a YouTube-compatible format. Same with the recent iMovie versions. At least I find that handy when coming up with a description and tags that way, because with the direct uploader, should the upload fail, I'd often have to write the description and tags all over again. So in many cases, I just write them in a text edit document and copy and paste them into the uploader when I'm ready. Also regarding video import, the new Final Cut Pro is definitely designed more for newer tapeless video recording devices that use solid-state flash memory storage or similar. Like my iPhone SE here, that I've had for almost a year now. Or the Canon Vixia HF R600 I usually use to make good vlogs and other similar videos on. And other similar high-definition camcorders that have been around for roughly 15 years. They're really easy to import the video from. Just hook up the device to the Mac via USB. Or if it uses internal memory cards like an SD card and whatnot, you just slide it into a built-in or external card reader for an even faster import. It's not like how the old Final Cut software is primarily designed for working with tape-based digital camcorders. Like a mini DV camera, such as this Canon Optura 60, the HDV camcorders from around that time as well. Like this Canon Vixia HV40, or the short-lived Digital 8 camcorders I talked about last year. Of course, tape-based camcorders like those are now obsolete, especially since you had to import the video in real time with such a capturing process. And today's flash memory HD camcorders shoot far better quality video than the tape-based ones, compared to earlier tapeless high-definition camcorders from 15 years ago that had inferior video quality to HDV and shot in formats that were more difficult to edit at the time, like AVC HD originally was. But the current new Final Cut Pro can still import from those tape-based digital camcorders and such, provided you have the means to connect it to your Mac via FireWire, such as daisy chaining these FireWire and Thunderbolt adapters to get her, to plug into the newer Macs that have Thunderbolt 3. A little cumbersome, but hey, it works. I found the newest macOS versions especially helps that you start the playback on the DV device before opening the capture utility. Make sure the sound goes through, regardless if you're using Final Cut or iMovie or the QuickTime player to capture the DV footage. And another big advantage the Final Cut Pro 10 always had over the old versions was its price range. The original Final Cut Pro, made from 1999 to 2011, always cost at least $1,000, which at the time was really expensive for a professional video editing application, especially since Adobe Premiere and other similar Windows programs like Vegas Pro and Avid Express DV cost considerably less, at around half that price. And it even got even more expensive. Starting with the 5th version of Final Cut Pro 2005, it would now be bundled with a suite of applications called Final Cut Studio and no longer be available separately, costing at $1,300. Where in addition to Final Cut Pro, it also included Compressor, Live Type, Motion, Soundtrack Pro, DVD Studio Pro. But they did also have Final Cut Express, as I already mentioned, which is a lot like Final Cut Pro, but had about 3/4 of the features, and around 1/5 of the cost of Final Cut Studio. It was aimed largely at prosumers and video hobbyists who wanted to go beyond iMovie, but didn't want to spend so much on Final Cut Pro. Well, when it came out, Final Cut Pro 10 cost only $300, around the price the original Final Cut Express did, no less. And so it's also affordable to the aforementioned prosumers and video hobbyists, and still costs that same price today. Compressor and Motion are also still around in similarly upgraded versions at $50 each. And as if that weren't enough, if you're a college student or a teacher, or then you could get the Apple Pro Apps for Education bundle, like I did when I was going for my computer degree. And the bundle gives you Final Cut Pro, Compressor, Motion, and audio applications, Logic Pro and MainStage, all for $200. That's a real bargain. And unlike the Adobe Creative Suite or Cyberlink Power Director or similar, with these Apple Pro apps you only pay once for the purchase price, and you can keep on using it for as long as you like and be eligible for free updates to newer versions. Yeah, it seems that Apple software generally isn't as expensive as it used to be. Perhaps due to Apple knowing how pricey their Macs have always been. So they make it easier on their customers, like the newest Mac OS versions being a free upgrade now instead of costing $130 for each new version as it did 15 years ago. And now iMovie and GarageBand are similar, free for Mac users as well, compared to when they had the iLife suite that cost around $80 when purchased separately, but it always comes pre-installed on all new Macs. And iMovie and GarageBand still do so today, making them all the more ideal for people starting out audiovisual production. And again, the way Final Cut Pro was redesigned and rewritten in 2011 is very reminiscent of when iMovie went for a similar rewrite in 2007. To make it faster and easier for consumers to use, but it was more limited on features. But of course, just like Final Cut Pro did, this new iMovie got better with each new release, adding some neat new features and bringing back missing features the old iMovie had. Bringing back detailed audio editing and the neat trailer feature iMovie 2010 was pretty neat, all of which remain in the current version of iMovie. The big difference though is that iMovie still no longer has third-party plugin support the way Final Cut Pro still does. Probably because Apple figured for iMovie, why allow third-party plugins when we could do some of those ourselves, like picture-in-picture and simple chroma key and other such effects that used to require third-party plugins in the original, like G3 Slick. And as I said, the new Final Cut Pro also seems to have more in common with the old iMovie than the newer iMovie versions do, such as including several of the same video effects, as I already mentioned. Not to mention the effects having customizable the way they were in the old iMovie, but with the added benefit of using keyframes typically found in professional editing applications, something the old iMovie never had. And so, not only do I find this new Final Cut Pro quicker and easier to use to get jobs done with than the old Final Cut versions were, but also better than iMovie. even the old versions. And since it came out 10 years ago, and I got my first Intel processor Mac shortly afterward, I found Final Cut Pro 10 to be a great program for making YouTube poops on the Mac, after often making them on iMovie and Adobe Premiere Pro for quite some time. And it's gotten to the point where nowadays I almost exclusively use Final Cut for making YouTube poops. Because in a way I find it to be a lot like the Apple version of Magix Vegas Pro, which is currently the most popular video editing application for YouTube poop makers. I also use Final Cut for other certain elaborate videos, like some vlogs or any more than one video track or customizable effects and such, or anything heavy with special effects, like my green screen remake of the Scooby-Doo 8-man mirror routine from a couple years ago. Heck, just for this video, I even edited this vlog on Final Cut Pro, just to prove my point. Of course, I still use iMovie for simpler videos, including many basic vlogs I'll do. Or I'll use Adobe Premiere Pro or Cyberlink Power Director for certain other somewhat elaborate videos. Like if I do a steamed hams video or something else that utilizes certain sound design techniques. But yeah, I can't believe it's been 10 years now since Final Cut Pro 10 came out. And now Apple even removed the 10 from its name. So it's now just called Final Cut Pro, in the same fashion as how they removed the 10 from Mac OS in 2016. Actually, now the Big Sur is what they call Mac OS 11. Later this year, Mac OS 12 Monterey comes out. The operating system wasn't changed as much, though, going from Mac OS 9 to OS 10 over 20 years ago. But even with that, here's to another 10 years of using these new versions of Final Cut Pro, or YouTube poops and whatnot, as long as I keep making them and you keep watching this YouTube channel.